It's that time of year again. Everyone knows that the holidays can become overwhelming quickly, so the sooner you get things done, the better. For both shoppers and businesses, the best time to score great deals during the holidays is Black Friday, Cyber Monday weekend. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, from household names to entrepreneurs who are participating in their first Black Friday, Cyber Monday this year. This Black Friday, join thousands of new entrepreneurs hearing for the first time with Shopify. Sign up for your free trial today at shopify.com/promo. That's shopify.com/promo. Go to shopify.com/promo and make this Black Friday one to remember.
BTW FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an adjustable implant, 68 milligrams radio pain. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay? TTYL.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. You can tell, Kieran, I think experienced listeners will go, hang on, there's no little chuckle there at the start. So that must mean this is a serious interview intro. Yes, it is, but also occasionally I can count myself in, but I'm just slightly baffled by the fact that within the few moments since we stopped recording and started recording, you've changed your shirt, Kieran.
Well, it's a bit like if you go to a cocktail party and you've got two people wearing the same dress. The fact that we were wearing the same sort of black and white check jackets earlier, or shirts earlier, I felt like, just in case this does go out visual, will people start to say things? Will they start to draw the wrong conclusions that we are joined at the hip these days? So I decided to go for a different colour. I don't know what the different colour is, but I know that it's different.
It's black.
Okay.
It's not check, yeah. It would be a miracle if it does go out visual, Kieran, but who knows what producer guy does with this when we're not watching. By all accounts, apparently, David Beckham has never worn the same pair of pants twice.
Really?
Yeah, since he got his first football check. Apparently, he prides himself. I don't know what he does. He's obviously got a lot in his duster drawer. He's probably got a duster room, but never worn the same pair of pants twice. It's an interview, Kieran. It's an interview with... he's a friend of the show. He's somebody that you and I both know from years back. Somebody that was very influential back in the day with the start of the football fanzine trend. He started the brilliant Off the Ball, which was along with When Saturday Comes, was the first of the two fanzines that really broke through. And Adrian Goldberg has just written a book called Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football. We interviewed him and we tried to keep it short, but this is as short as we could keep it. Adrian, thank you so much for joining us today. It's normally I'll start the pod by chuckling at Kieran's countdown, but because we've got a serious guest on, he decided to do a serious countdown. That's put me on the back foot a little bit. I can't wait to talk to you, and it's a really good book, as we discussed in the intro. But for the very few people listening who don't know you, Adrian, could you just tell us a little bit about your career in broadcasting and in football?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's all joined together, really, because I started, as I mentioned in the book, really as a fanzine editor in the mid-'80s, and I started my football fanzine Off the Ball, which, like When Saturday Comes, was a general football fanzine. And my team, West Brom, at the time, although we didn't know it then, were about to start a 16-year descent from the top division. But actually, the club was not badly run from the perspective of it didn't have owners who were interested in taking money out of the club. They weren't owners who wanted to make money out of the club. They were well-meaning people who didn't really know very much about top-level football, or they kind of lost control of the club, really, in terms of keeping it successful on the field. But around that time, in the mid-'80s, you'll remember this as a fan, Kevin, we were routinely lambasted in the press. All football supporters were viewed as shaven-headed hooligans. That was our stereotype. We were all written off as thugs. And clearly there was an issue with match day violence, and I'd never seek to underplay that. But there were also these people who I called hooligans in the boardroom who were in operation. People like, older listeners may remember, David Bulstrode, who wanted to merge Fulham and Queen's Park Rangers and create this Frankenstein Fulham Park Rangers. He, shockingly, you may be surprised to hear, was a property developer.
Yeah.
So he had eyes on some prime London property. There was Ken Weldon at Birmingham City. Ken Weldon was also the owner of Walsall Football Club, and he wanted to move Walsall to play at St Andrews and Groundshare. Ken Weldon was a scrap metal dealer and a property developer, which would have gone in very handy if he'd managed to sell Fellows Park. And of course, there was the daddy of them all, Robert Maxwell, who wanted to merge Oxford and Reading and create this horrific monster called Thames Valley Royals. So I just couldn't, as a young fan, I just couldn't understand how there was this narrative about fans. We never used the word narrative back then, by the way. there was this narrative about fans, and we were depicted in a certain way, and yet these fine, upstanding members of the boardroom were trying to destroy football as we knew it. So that's what got me into journalism. And so I started making a fanzine, literally selling it on the streets with my mates Steve and Sid and my then girlfriend Sally. And, you know, we literally went to the streets at a time when we were told you couldn't do that because football supporters are all going to kick your head in. And we did it. And that really was the start of my journalism career, for want of a better word. And for people who don't know, then I branched out. And I've worked as an investigative journalist, still work for File on 4 Investigates on Radio 4. For a decade, I fronted a programme called 5 Live Investigates on Radio 5 Live. I worked on Watchdog and so on. But in all of those various capacities, I've always tried to wedge football stories in and stories of football chicanery. And just incredible, really, over that time, the number of clubs who flirted with disaster. Some of them have gone out of business, of course, and the lack of desire by football's regulators, be they the FA, be they the Football League, be they the Premier League, to actually grapple with these big issues. So that's kind of the origin of writing of the book, and that's a bit of an upsum of my career. I bet you're wishing you never asked now.
Well, I knew it, but there will be 3 or 4 people listening who maybe didn't. I'm going to come back later on to the fanzine thing, because it's not necessarily about football finance, but when Saturday comes and Off the Ball changed the landscape of football journalism, and it was followed by many other brilliant clubs. And so I think it's important for younger listeners in particular to realise how important you were at that time. But just in terms, before I talk to you about West Brom and from where I think the conversation will go anywhere, I don't know. But just in terms of the book, Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football. It's an important book at a difficult time. Is it one you've been planning for a long time, or did you suddenly think a year ago, if I don't write this now, it could be too late?
A bit of both, really. I mean, I remember talking to people about the way football was going in the late 90s after the creation of the Premier League, and wanting to pick up the threads of the fanzine message, if you like, in that period. And just for reasons of work and family, it proved difficult at that time. So it's an idea that refused to go away. But I think the moment that made it come home to me was a game in late November, I think, 2022, when it really came home to my club. And it was very much like a rock concert, you know, Coldplay, Bruce Springsteen, whoever, Taylor Swift, Kieran for you, and, you know, people waving around their mobile phones on the 12th minute of a certain game. And, of course, we weren't waving our mobile phones in celebration of our favourite song. It was a protest, waving our mobile phone lights. And Ali Jones, who I know you've interviewed many times on the pod from Action for Albion, orchestrated that. And I just thought, how is it here I am sitting in my regular seat in the Birmingham Road end, and I've written about all this stuff, all and broadcast about this stuff over many years. And now it's come to me, to my club, which, unless something changes very soon, we're going to be bankrupt. Our ground had been mortgaged. The club had borrowed money that it had no way of paying back. So that was the catalyst really for saying, right, I've reported on this for all these other clubs. How has it come home to me now? And how do I trace that journey from fanzine writer to now? So it's partly a personal memoir. And what I wanted to do, I often say, by the way, in interviews, Kieran, you'll like this. I say, I'm not Kieran Maguire. I'm not an accountant. And I mean that in a complimentary way because, nobody can decode a spreadsheet like you, Kieran. But that's not how I've approached it because I'm not an accountant. And what I've tried to do is get fans' stories. So tell my own fan story, but tell the story of other fans at places like Blackpool and Wimbledon, but also Manchester United, Man City and Liverpool. And just get this span of football. What's happened to football over the last 40 years? Well, I've been a fan, and as it's come to the point where my own club's future was threatened.
Well, I mean, talking of Wimbledon, they almost nearly didn't exist 40 years ago because Ron Nodes wanted to merge Palace and Wimbledon, which didn't go down well with anybody. You're going to have to work harder than that to get back into Kieran's good books after that Taylor Swift reference, because he went to see Stiff Little Fingers last week. He's not going to see Taylor Swift.
I know. I think Kieran and I share a lot of musical tastes, actually. I did a music radio show on a community station called Brum Radio, and Kieran came on and brought forward a brilliant selection of punk and post-punk classics. So don't worry, we're on common ground there.
How much of it was The Cure?
Only 7/10 of it. But that said, The Cure's album last year was the best album released last year. It was a great record.
Right, I'll tell you what, I'll bring Parachute Payments in now. I'll go off for 20 minutes. You can have 20 minutes of The Cure and Parachute Payments. The West Brom fan, it strikes me, we spoke to your current owner, Sheelan Patel, recently, and it strikes me that you're in good hands. But would you say that West Brom, in the years before he took over, have been a textbook example of how not to run a club? And in particular, this is one of the things I'm really interested in, the difficulties you've had in discovering the actual financial machinations behind the club, the whole stuff with the loans going on. We saw Birmingham trying to discover who actually owned Birmingham City for a while. Would you think, beyond the West Brom question, do you think that the notion of the complete lack of transparency at those clubs was the most frustrating thing? Because it runs throughout the book, that notion of a lack of transparency.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was certainly the case with West Brom, and we did an exercise, and I got a friend who was living in China at the time and can speak expert Mandarin, was able to go to the Shanghai Stock Exchange and identify who were the key shareholders behind West Brom. And although the club at the time listed a guy called Guochan Lai, who people will know as, quotes, the owner, and there were 3 investment companies who'd invested in West Brom. What lay behind that? Well, it turned out there were 80 different entities more than 80 different entities that lay behind West Brom as investors, some of which were regional governments in China. And this obviously followed the Chinese government, President Xi, and his desire to make China a global football superpower. So who were those 80-odd entities that sat behind Guochan Lai? What leverage did they have over him? And when I put that out on a Substack, I got contacted by a contact in the Channel Islands who works in the financial industry. And they said, oh, you've only scratched the surface.
Wow.
There are people lying behind that. There's more than 1,000 entities lying behind West Brom. The Birmingham City chapter is just mind-boggling. I spoke to a guy called Daniel Ivory, who did far more work than any local journalist to find out what was going on about Birmingham City. He identified a character colloquially known as Mr. King, who was said to be the person pulling the strings at Birmingham City, but who was never acknowledged by the football club. I spoke to Shabana Mahmood, now the Home Secretary, who was the local MP. She said she even named Mr. King in Parliament, used parliamentary privilege to say, who is this character? Is he really pulling the strings behind Birmingham City? And who is he accountable to? And even though she was the MP and raised it in Parliament, she got no answer. I've raised the question directly with Birmingham City and the EFL on more than one occasion and had no joy. But according to Daniel and other journalists who've looked into it, there is this character and this whole web of companies that go out to the Cayman Islands, the Virgin Islands, and so on. And you scratch your head and you think, well, who are the people in the English game who are responsible for supervising this? Who cares enough in the English game? Because I think that's what it goes back to. Who of our administrators cares enough to want to know what is really, really going on here?
If I can bring Kieran in here, Adrian, because there's the problem with the owners and directors test, or whatever you want to call it, is that you are reliant, you're trusting the fact that the club has given you the name of the person who is actually running the club, when it turns out in quite a few occasions in Adrian's book, they're not the people running the club. So it's impossible to do an owners and directors test on somebody who may well be a corporation or may well have never been in the country or been in the ground of the club that they apparently own.
Yes, it is very cloudy, very murky, and you end up in cul-de-sacs, especially once you start to go offshore, because you're never going to get anything out of BVI or Cayman Islands or many of these places. And it becomes very frustrating. I do think that the Premier League and the EFL have upped their game in the last 4 to 5 years. That the evidence would suggest that. And I am fully aware that we have an existing cohort of owners where perhaps greater scrutiny and greater delving into their backgrounds perhaps would be beneficial. But there's no desire from that, because it's the football clubs who vote for how the Premier League administration and how the EFL administration is going to be run. They would also argue that those costs incurred would be better spent elsewhere. So it becomes difficult. But we would have had some terrible owners potentially in the last few years had both the Premier League and the EFL not really done some pretty decent work. And I will name check 777 partners as one prime example. I was looking this morning. I have 777 partners on Google Alerts, and that is a regular message that I get. So yes, I think they are heading in the right direction. Ultimately, if somebody wants to be clandestine, then the nature of legislation, the nature of globalization makes it very, very difficult to find out who's behind things.
Yeah, I suppose my challenge to that, Kieran, would be that, yes, they have got better. They have got better from the moment, really, that governments, and this both Conservative and Labour, have seriously threatened a regulator. That's really, for me, the only time that the EFL, the Premier League and the FA have started to take this kind of issue really seriously. They may feel that's unfair. There's a chapter in the book, and I'm really pleased with this chapter. I went to speak to Lord Faulkner. Lord Faulkner was part of the Football Task Force in 1999 with people like Andy Burnham, now the Mayor of Greater Manchester, of course. And I'm sure you'll both remember this, that, you know, the Blairite government, which came in 97, wanted to align itself to football, saw a commonality between its voters and traditional football supporters, and said, OK, how can we make football better? Because at that time, the issues were not so much about ownership, but about the cost of football and how football was being priced beyond the reach of ordinary working class people. So they set up a football task force and look at the range of issues in the game. And that task force, which encompassed, it consulted with clubs, it had supporters, it had various community organisations, it had the great and the good, people like Sir Herman Ousley, I think, was on the football task force. And it also had independent voices as well. I think there's a guy who was part of the, Water UK was part of the football task force to make sure that it wasn't just all football people talking to football people. And they produced this report, and I quote from it quite liberally in the book, which, clearly said that the issues that are facing football now will be best addressed by a system of regulation which involves restrictions on ownership, tighter restrictions on ownership, and much greater scrutiny of who's coming into the game, and concern about cost of the game, the pricing of football. And there was consensus by all the groups who were engaged in the task force, apart from the FA, the Premier League and the Football League, who basically lent, especially the Premier League, as I understand it, lent on the government and said, no, we're this great British export. You don't want to clip our wings now. And then for another quarter of a century, the chance of serious regulation of football was lost. And in that period, you then have the arrival of the likes of Abramovich, you have oil money coming into English football, you have the Chinese investors coming into English football, and not all of those things were bad, and not every aspect of them was bad. But overall, the trend was to take football away from people, the people who traditionally supported it, and away from proper supervision. It was a really, really a tragedy, I think. It was a moment missed for football.
BTW FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an adjustable implant, 68 milligrams radio pair. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay, TTYL.
Everything you say, Adrian, leads me on to something that I was going to ask you about later on, basically. But off the back of that, I'm particularly interested in the overseas investment issue, which, of course, is a massive theme of the book. Just Kieran and I know from experience, it can be hard not to talk about foreign ownership of English clubs without sounding xenophobic, which none of us want to do because we are the opposite of gammon. But it's also hard not to be worried about, for example, the growing American influence in the game. So if we spoke to Harry Hugo a few weeks ago, who's the owner of Farnham Town, who are in level 7, I think, of English football, who said there are clubs in that level who are fighting off American investors. So they want to get involved in every aspect of the game. And that is a worry, but also you're worried about what happens when they get bored and they decide that they want another plaything. So it is difficult to walk that balance and say, look, we're talking about English football and we're not worried about them because they're foreign. We're worried about them, what they want to buy into English football for.
Yeah, and I think we have to differentiate, don't we, between American owners. There's a lot of them.
Yeah, of course. They will have
different interests. Fenway Sports Group will have a different interest in football than the owners of Walsall Football Club, than the owners of Carlisle United Football Club. Who, in some ways, some American owners are a throwback, I think, to the old kind of slightly paternalistic ownership of English football clubs. These are people who've done well for themselves. They are not rich enough to own major sports franchises in the United States, which are priced astronomically, but they are rich enough to afford, let's say, a middle-ranking English championship football club like mine. Yeah. And in fact, Shilan Patel, it was the interview with you guys where he said, look, if I go to a dinner party and I speak to people and they say, what do you do? He said, I'm a software engineer or whatever. I've made my money in software. People, the eyes droop and they move over to the canapes. Whereas if he says, I'm the owner of a championship football club in England, people's eyes light up and, what? Really? Tell me more about it. So I think there is that level of American involvement that people just want it because they've made money. It gives them an interest, and they can make a difference through the ownership of a football club. But clearly, at the top end, you look at the owners of Chelsea, the owners of Liverpool, the owners of Manchester United. We saw where they wanted to go in 2021, didn't we?
Yeah.
Where they played their hand with the Super League. But there are other more insidious things as well. There were a chapter on Manchester City and a chapter on Newcastle United, and you really feel the conflict here. Man City, I interview Stephen Holt. Stephen is the lead singer of the Inspiral Carpets, who are a great band.
Yeah.
Like them, Kieran? We're on that. Yeah, we're on the same page with the Inspiral Carpets. And Stephen's a great guy, and of an age with us, and he's seen the club in its dark days, in the Peter Swales era, and all that. And who doesn't love a Man City fan? They were always known as great fans, incredibly loyal, taking all the ups and downs with great humour over the years. And now he supports a team that's hugely successful. The football fan in you thinks, how can I begrudge you your moment of glory as a fan, your moment of success? But you look at how UAE money is operated through Manchester City to gain political leverage in Manchester, and who, in the eyes of Dave Haslam, who is a well-known former Hacienda DJ who lives in Manchester, Dave feels that you look at the way the city centre of Manchester has gone, a lot of that is Abu Dhabi and UAE money. You sense through the influence of that money that Manchester's lost something of its radical edge. This is the city of the Peterloo massacre, the city of suffragettes, a city with a proud radical tradition, but where people who do not particularly welcome press attention, where people who don't necessarily welcome freedom of expression have gained a foothold in the city. That's even more pronounced, I have to say, in Newcastle, where you've got Saudi owners, where it's just so interesting just a few days ago that a group of councillors on Newcastle spoke up against the execution by Saudi Arabia of people who committed crimes when they were children, and they'd served time in prison, were then executed. All of those councillors were either independents or Greens, but Labour and Conservative, the two main groups on Newcastle City Council, did not speak out against this. And there's this reluctance to speak out in Newcastle, and nevertheless, the fact the club is owned effectively by the Saudi state, and so the kind of the censorship and the self-censorship that you see in Saudi Arabia has kind of been exported to Newcastle, and I think that's really troubling for our democracy. Never mind football. I know this is a bit big for a football podcast. Forgive me, but I think it is. It is there, that concern.
It strikes me that the Newcastle Man City chapters, in a way, are the crux of the book, if you like, the heart of the matter. Because there will be people who live in Manchester now who are attracted there by the fact that the city centre is now wonderful. You've got canal side, but it's like living in Spain or Italy, who have no interest in football whatsoever, and even less interest in where the finances came from to develop these great cities. But you spoke to people, fans of those clubs, who are very eloquently trying to demonstrate their distress at the owners of those clubs. But it seems to me, and you acknowledge this, that they're kind of crying out in the wilderness. And the real difficulty is that so many fans of those clubs, and we had this discussion when Colonel Gaddafi's son was talking about buying Palace. For every fan like me who were going, well, this can't be allowed to happen, there were 10 who were going, if it gets us in Europe, I don't. Do you know, that's the problem, because football fans are masters at burying their heads in the sand and pretending these issues are too big for us to deal with. Let's just enjoy the success on the pitch. And for all that you say that, you can't deny that in that area of Manchester has enormously benefited from the money that's come in from Abu Dhabi, has it not?
It has. And the question then is, where does that money flow to?
Yeah.
That money flows out of the UK. It flows to Abu Dhabi, and on 999-year leases. Yeah. And, it's like, again, I suppose what I try and do is have a bit of nuance about it. My book is not a polemic. I try and tell the stories through the eyes of the people who live it. And yes, the area around Ancoats, superficially, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but it looks much better than it did, and it's safer, and it's quotes nicer. But kind of at what price to the soul of the city of Manchester, and indeed what long-term price to the economics of the city of Manchester? I think these issues are even more pronounced in Newcastle for me, though, because people, really well-meaning Newcastle fans would say to me, look, when you fill up at the petrol station, do you worry about whether that oil's come from Saudi Arabia? Because there's a good chance it may well have done. And you have a government, and this is across parties, saying, let's bring in Saudi Arabia investment to help regenerate these, quotes, left behind areas. And in fact, after Newcastle's ownership by the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia was announced, within a couple of years, then a couple of big infrastructure projects connected to Saudi Arabia had been announced as well in the northeast of England. So I suppose what I'd say is, let's be honest about this, at least. If we're going to take money from states like Saudi Arabia, states like the UAE, let's at least be honest about it. I think when the Public Investment Fund sought to buy Newcastle United, the government will vehemently deny this. This was Boris Johnson's government, would vehemently deny putting pressure on the Premier League to sanction that takeover. I have to say the evidence suggests quite strongly that the opposite may be true. And you look at freedom of information requests and various meetings that were held and the background to Britain's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and I think it was pretty nailed on that the government wanted that takeover to happen. And again, let us be clear that whatever form of words the Premier League used to justify the Public Investment Fund taking over, Newcastle United is owned by the Saudi Arabian state. And that's a state whose de facto leader has been responsible for commissioning the killing of a journalist and for repressing human rights, according to many independent observers.
Yeah. We have a similar problem in our industry with the Saudi Arabian Comedy Festival, when most of us are just asking the people who took part in it to be honest about the reasons they took part in it, rather than trying to sell us this story about, no, it's helping to liberalise Saudi Arabia. Us being able to, we can do jokes about women being bad drivers in Saudi Arabia now. It's like, come on, guys. We'd all have much more respect for you if you told us the real reason you did it. Moving back to football and football finance, which I think our producer would be mentally hastening us to do. Is there one particular event, and I think I can guess the answer to this, but is there one particular event in the recent history of English football that you think was the moment that things started to change forever? Was the tipping point, for example, when you think this game is getting away from us fans now?
Yeah, I think there are various staging points, and the arrival of all of these inflows of money, whether from China, whether from the Gulf, from Roman Abramovich, all of those are important milestones, and they all take football in a particular financialized direction away from ordinary traditional supporters, the people like us, traditionally, who are sometimes disparagingly regarded as legacy supporters. But my 10-year-old daughter comes to the baggage with me. She is a legacy supporter. She is, because, she understands. She's bought into the culture. She's bought into what it means to be a football fan, and to understand that you win some, you lose some, and you keep going. And it's not about your latest shiny bit of merchandise. That might be part of it, but really, it's about supporting your team through thick and thin. And but I do think the creation of the Premier League in 1992 represented a kind of theft of the game from its traditional supporters and from its roots. There's a chapter in the book where I go and see David Dean. I've got a lot of respect for David Dean. He did fantastic things for Arsenal. David Dean tries to persuade me, really, that 92 was a response to 1989 and the awful tragedy at Hillsborough. And again, I don't want to be disrespectful to David Dein, because I think fundamentally he's a guy who has done many good things in football, but he kind of tells me the story that after going to see the Hicks family, and the Hickses lost 2 daughters at Hillsborough, he came away from that meeting with the parents of the girls who died saying, football has got to change. It cannot carry on like this. And that in the moment, that might be true. Let's be honest about it. The Premier League was being engineered a decade before that. In 1983, the principle that clubs share some of their gate money with away fans was done away with. That was clearly a move done in favour of the bigger, already wealthier clubs. They saw what was coming with the arrival of pay-per-view television. They wanted their hands on more of that money. And I wrote something in Off the Ball. I'd been to see the chairman of Blackpool, Ken Chadwick, in sight of the old gas towers at Eastville. They were playing away at Bristol Rovers. And he just said, these guys, and he referred to the people who were then the Big Five. So this was 5 or 6 years before the creation of the Premier League. So Man United, Spurs, Arsenal, Liverpool and Everton, as they were then the Big Five. He said the directors of these clubs should be kicked out of the Football League because they don't have our interests at heart. They are working against the interests of the Football League. And as the TV deals started to develop, and they wanted more money, they got more money. They wanted more voting rights for the top division. They got more voting rights for the top division. They got everything they wanted, and it still wasn't enough for them. So it's quite grim to think. I think Hillsborough was a catalyst in many ways, and it was a catalyst for some good things in football. But I truly think that the people who ran the wealthiest clubs in English football, the biggest clubs in English football, took advantage of it for their own financial gain.
I have to say that the David Dein chapter, which is one of the shorter chapters in the book, I found that quite a difficult read, because you're very good at letting people speak for themselves. You don't put words into people's mouth. You don't pass judgment on what they've told you. But when he's reading what he said about the Hicks family, you just go, I'm sure he's absolutely sincere about it. I am absolutely sure. But it also shuts down any argument, because then you can't contradict him saying that, basically, can you? Because without looking like the most harsh. I think the phrase I've used is healthy contempt when you talk about the FA. Because I would recommend that anybody listening to this book who works for the FA probably doesn't put it on their Christmas list, because I understand why, but the FA come in for a lot of stick, basically for standing by and not doing much, rather than anything they did do. Yeah,
well, there you have the great character, the great figure of Graham Kelly, don't you? God, who I met again in my fanzine days, and I said to him, it was a weird meeting in a hotel bedroom by the NEC. It was just an odd meeting. But I said to him, and I recorded this. It's the value of having the fanzines to go back to, is that I really did record this and write it up at the time. There was a lot of talk. People, again, will remember of a certain age. Margaret Thatcher wanted every fan to carry a membership card to access football. That was her cure for football hooliganism. We called it an ID card and resented it as a harsh imposition, which would have threatened the future of football. So I went to see Kelly and talk about that. And I said, look, never mind a membership scheme for fans. There are so many rogues in the boardrooms. We need a membership scheme for directors. And he kind of was just clipping his toenails at the time. That's how weird it was. And he said, that's interesting. The moment had gone. But, here we are in 2025. That was, I think, in about 87 or 88. Here we are in 2025 talking about owners and directors tests and how in the last 4 or 5 years they've got better, but that actually football couldn't get its own house in order. It needed a government to create a regulator to do the job that football should have been doing for itself. So, healthy contempt. I don't know how healthy it is, but certainly it's contempt.
Danny Butterfield told us a story at a live Palace pod thing last year about a similar situation. We were trying to have a conversation with Neil Warnock after training. Neil Warnock coming out of the shower naked, smothering himself in deep heat in various intimate crevices while he was trying to talk about whether he could get a pay rise or not. You've mentioned the fanzine. I want to take as brief a detour as possible here to just talk about that fanzine culture, because I remember back pages at Sports Shop of blessed memory in
Sports
pages.
Sports pages
In Charing Cross Road, where if you had a half hour to spare, you'd go in and flick through Coventry City's fanzine, because you could buy the fanzines of every club. I remember the Eagle Eye, Palace Echo, all the brilliant fanzines, but they were your off the ball and when Saturday comes, the general football ones were real game changers for us football fans, because there was no one in the national press or even in the local press who were reflecting the views of fans at the time when we were an attacked breed. We were under pressure. Never mind the argument about whether it was the fault of the police or the fault of the football fans. We were reviled by a lot of society, and you were the first people to put your hand up and give our point of view and stand up for us. And at the time, that was incredibly important.
Well, I like to think so.
No, I think it was.
But I tell you what about that, Kev, because I'm an Albion fan. I'm a season ticket holder. I'm as one-eyed as anybody else. But I think one thing that became apparent in that era, because we were a reviled breed, and that allowed the police, very particular policing culture had been allowed to develop in the 1980s, and I think keen students of politics will know that Margaret Thatcher seemed to encourage police brutality. Can I call it that? I think I can. Around picket lines. Yeah, I think I can call it that. Around picket lines and so on. And kind of football fans were, we weren't pickets at Orgreave, but we were a weekly version of that, or we could be if we were perceived to represent any kind of threat. So the policing of football was horrendous, and would, I think, today be a political issue in its own right. So to answer that question, I kind of think that, I had a sense as a one-eyed fan that I love my club and I wanted to do it well, but I also felt that we ought to have a greater communal sense of ourselves as football fans. And in episode 1, I went to see the great Rogan Taylor in Liverpool and stood on the Kop with him as an away fan, watching Albion get stuffed by 4-1. But just that sense that, yes, there is plenty that divides us. We love the tribalism. It's part of what makes football what it is. But for everything that divides us, there is something that unites us. And it is the love that we have of this great game. And still, I think football is the greatest game. It's a wonderful game. I watch a game down the park. It's a brilliant, brilliant, simple game. And as a fan, you have this buy into your club, which is the same, whether it's Liverpool, whether it's West Bromwich Albion, whether it's Brighton, whether it's Crystal Palace. You have the same buy-in, and you have this set of shared experiences. So that was something I just kind of felt was really important to bring to the fore in that era. Rogan articulated it far better than anybody else I'd ever heard before or since. Yeah. And he was the founder of the Football Supporters Association. John Peel had talked about a campaign for real football as an equivalent to the campaign for real ale. Yeah. He did that on a Noel Edmonds house party. This is true. And so there was a few things in the air at that time. And the mainstream press was generally horrendous around these issues, as you say. They're very keen to just write us all off. There were one or two exceptions who I think deserve credit, people like Paddy Barclay and Phil Shaw in The Guardian, who they used to do a soccer diary in the football diary in The Guardian. And, mentioning that, which we got very early on, led to us getting hundreds of subscribers. And clearly we were, we had identified something for which there was a need. And I think what fanzines did as well as a whole I think we created the space into which Nick Hornby was able to step. We created I'm not being disparaging to Nick Hornby. I think he's a brilliant writer, and Fever Pitch was a great book. But I think Fever Pitch, no, you're questionable. It's a long time since I read it, but at the time it felt important.
Yeah.
Anyway, we can argue about Nick Hornby, but at the time it felt hugely important that actually he were people who were representing our experiences and our views, and in a non-threatening, non-violent way.
Yeah.
I think that set the tone then for the kind of rejuvenation of football in the 90s.
Strange days, the mid-'80s. I mean, in one way, a horrible, brutal time, but you also had John Peel and Mr. Blobby on the same TV show. So, yeah.
Well, Peel was a great supporter as well, and there was a lot of crossover between kind of football and football fanzines and indie music.
Yeah, Pat Nevin. There you go. Let's, as producer Guy will be saying in the edit suite here, not that much editing takes place. Let's get back to football finance. What is it with you and parachute payments? And obviously, I'm going to bring Kieran in on this afterwards. But you don't like them, do you? You're a Gingham.
100%, yeah. I think parachute payments are a contrick, really. I think they're designed by the Premier League to protect its own commercial interest. And again, the basic concept, as they see it, is that if clubs are encouraged to spend lots of money whilst they're in the Premier League, knowing that there's an insurance policy at the end of it when they get relegated, that keeps the Premier League to a certain level, which helps it sell television rights across the world, and therefore keeps the richest clubs in the Premier League in the style to which they are accustomed. Great, as far as it goes. Unfortunately, completely distorts the Championship. And of course, having parachute payments does not guarantee that you'll get promoted the next season, as indeed we are seeing this season. But it does grossly distort the Championship. I think there was some research showing that parachute payments are worth, on average, 16 points a season to a relegated club. And I think that they are also partly responsible for the financial disaster zone. And Kieran's written and spoken about this, the financial disaster zone that is the Championship. Because if you've got three, and maybe because they're over 3 seasons, you might have 4 or 5 teams with parachute payments in your division, you want to compete with them. That encourages owners then to spend money they haven't got to try and keep up with the Joneses. And everything is sucked towards this financial arms race, which is driven by parachute payments in the Championship.
And I suppose the problem is as well, Kieran, and Adrian articulates this very well in the book, is that the fact that parachute payments only exist for 3 seasons. So in those 3 seasons, the clubs are desperate to get back to the Premier League, because once the parachute money disappears, you're probably stuck in the Championship forever. And that's not a bad thing as far as football fans are concerned, but for club owners, it's a disaster. That's part of the problem that Adrian talks about in the book, that it's become a disaster not to be in the Premier League. So it does seem to me that 3 seasons is part of the problem, Kieran.
It is. It's only 2 seasons for those clubs that are promoted and then relegated, and it used to be 4. Yeah. So I think they have made some steps in the right direction. I absolutely understand where Adrian's coming from. The Premier League wants a successful Premier League. And then we have to make a broader decision. Do you want a more competitive Premier League, or do you want a more competitive Championship? Well, the money, which ultimately flows through from the Premier League to the Championship and League One and League Two, and that money is still considerable. It's still £5 million per club per season. That wouldn't be there if we had a less competitive Premier League. What do you do? And I was initially opposed to parachute payments, and I spoke to a couple of people who, one was a current chief executive of a Premier League club, and one was a former chief executive of a Premier League club, and they both said the same things. We've just been promoted to the Premier League. our players are not good enough to survive in that division. So therefore we need to sign 5 or 6. If we were to offer a player 40 grand a week, and if we are relegated, you have to take an 80% pay cut, we don't get the players. And therefore we're effectively signing off our own death warrants. And when I reflected on that, it does have some validity. For me, the issue is not the parachute payments. The issue is the cliff face between the Premier League and the Championship. Parachute payments are a clumsy but ultimately effective way of ensuring that when clubs are relegated from the Premier League, that they don't go bankrupt. And I've got the data for every single relegated club. Wages do go down on average by around about 40%, but they would have to go down by 80% without them. And the EFL has parachute payments when clubs drop from League 2 to the National League. They have parachute payments when clubs drop from the Championship to League 1. UEFA have a quasi form of parachute payments when they're using their 5 and 10 year coefficients. I don't know what a better solution is, but I don't inherently want them. And this all goes back, and again, we're talking about mistakes made in former times. This all goes back for what I consider to be the dumbest decision ever made in football, which was when the Premier League was set up. The clubs in the EFL were offered 25% of a combined TV deal, and they said, "Sling your hook, we can do better ourselves." And what we have seen since then is the Premier League accelerating in terms of revenue at 3. And the EFL has done very well, but if you're going at 80 miles an hour and the person in the lane next to you is going at 200 miles an hour, yes, you're going fast. But and that has led to the position we're in now.
I agree with so much of what you say there, Kieran. I'm not against parachute payments per se. I think the idea of some kind of financial cushion makes some kind of sense, but because you have got the car going at 200 miles an hour against the car going at 80 miles an hour, that's where your problem is. And that cliff edge, to mix our metaphors, that cliff edge that you talk about hasn't just happened, has it? It's been engineered. It's a structural defect of football that has occurred since the creation of the Premier League in 1992. Yes, the bigger clubs did offer a better deal than the EFL realised it was being offered at the time. And yes, they were foolish to take it. They were foolish not to take it. But it was the creation of the Premier League that set in train this whole business and this fracturing of the solidarity and the community of the 92. So yes, the EFL not speak up for the people who've led the EFL over the years, but the original sin is the creation of the Premier League. And I think unless that is repaired, you're going to have this situation of inequality. We've effectively, I think I use this line in the book that really, the inequality, the Thatcherite inequality of British society was enacted on the football fields of England through the creation of the Premier League. I think there are ways to deal with the parachute payments more adequately, though, and I think that the disproportionality in income between the Premier League and the rest is what drives clubs when they get relegated not to pay off their higher earners, which your common sense might say, look, here we've got 30 million quid or whatever. Let's pay off our higher earners and try and compete on a level playing field with other Championship clubs. Owners and directors don't think like that, do they? They think, we've got 30 million quid here. Let's hire the best and most expensive players that we can in the Championship and try and get back to the Premier League because that's where all the money is. And again, if it works, it's great. If it doesn't work, you've saddled your club with more debts further down the line, which is exactly what happened with West Brom and happens with quite a lot of clubs, that clubs don't use it. Yes, they may reduce their wage bill, but mostly they still continue overpaying on the basis that they will get back in the Premier League. which is great until they don't.
Yeah, I have to say we have two of our long-term listeners who were involved in the formation of the Premier League to a greater or lesser degree, and both of them still stand by it if they think the Premier League is the saviour of English football. But I'll let them deal with you rather than me trying to, as I disagree with them. I've got two questions for you. I'm conscious of time, Adrian, because apparently we pay our editor by the hour. We can't go into golden time. The second question, you're an experienced broadcaster, so you can probably predict what it's going to be, but I really like the chapter on German football and German fan culture. Kieran and I are big fans of it, in particular the way that German football has managed to keep ticket prices realistic for those people who want to go and watch football. But I'm not sure I entirely agree with you when you say that they, on the whole, their fans tend to be better organised and better campaigners of fans here, because I think the Super League protests here were very effective. But I probably do agree with the fact that maybe do you suggest that English fans could be better organised, could be more passionate, less ad hoc, shall we say, about the response to things?
I think so. I think it might just be a cultural thing. I think that we are, we're grumblers, aren't we? West Brom, we've got to pay 45 quid. West Brom have got to pay 45 quid to go and watch Coventry in a few weeks' time. The same price has been visited on Swansea City fans over Christmas. Kids' prices there, 35 quid. Yeah. I'm not going. It would take 80 quid to take me and my daughter to that game. Sure. I'm not going. But Coventry won't care as long as they get 2,800 and fill the away end. And, people will grumble. And I think in Germany, there's partly a fan tradition as well, I think, of being more active about these things. But, is it a coincidence that when Sheffield Wednesday fans who've grumbled very reasonably for a long time about the plight of their club, but when they actually boycotted their game against Middlesbrough, within a few days, Chancery had gone. The administration papers were signed. That was the point at which I'm sure Chancery realised there's no way back here. There's no way back. So, I'd love to see English fans being a bit more radical and spending less time on social media, more time talking to each other in smoke-filled rooms and plotting the revolution.
and finally, I'm aware, Adrian, this is the question that Alex Jones would ask you at the end of the One Show, were you to go on here. The subtitle... I
thought you were talking about the InfoWars guy there for a minute. You had me really worried then.
Oh, no.
I'm not an expert in Sandy Hook, mate.
In general, my references will be popular culture, Adrian. You can normally jump to that conclusion. The subtitle for the book is the Battle for the Soul of English Football. Is it a battle that can still be won?
I think it's a battle that all of us who care about the game can fight on a weekly basis. I've got to say, it's been quite a cerebral interview. I don't know what's got into you today, Kevin, but I think that my favourite chapters in the book, can I just say this, are the Blackpool chapters when Blackpool fans boycotted for 4 years against the Oyston ownership, and the AFC Wimbledon story, which is an incredible... I mean, just think this is a club that was told to have a football club setting up independently of the club that had moved to Buckinghamshire that calls itself Wimbledon is not in the wider interests of the game. That's what the independent panel said. Yeah. And yet Blackpool fans got their club back. AFC Wimbledon fans got their club back. Read those inspirational stories and believe that you as a fan, and in concert with other fans, believe that you can make a difference. If that's one message I've got, the battle for the soul of English football is ongoing and we're all a part of it, all of us who care about football. So let's fight for it. Let's work together. Let's enjoy our tribalism, but sometimes let's settle and put aside our differences and work for the good of this great game that we all care so passionately about, because you can make a change.
Brilliant. Lovely. Thanks so much, Adrian. Best of luck with the book. I can thoroughly recommend it to anybody who's listening.
It's been great chatting to both of you guys, and I totally respect what you do. You do fantastic podcasts and fantastic work, so it's a real honour to be here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adrian. Appreciate that. It's always a pleasure to talk to Adrian, Kieran, but there are three areas I particularly wanted to just mention to you. The chapters on the trying to discover who actually owned West Brom and who owned Birmingham are just so frustrating, because we know your views on transparency, but this is not just not transparent. It's opaqueness for the sake of it, and so opaque, and they seem to have taken such lengths to hide who the real owner was that you can only suspect their motives for doing so.
That's right. There's a good case for always saying, if you've got nothing to hide, hide nothing. And this is why I get a bee in my bonnet at times when there's late disclosure or no disclosure. People will say that an owner of a football club is entitled to a degree of privacy. And I push back on that. I wouldn't normally push back on that for other industries. If you've got a cardboard box manufacturing company, frankly, nobody cares. But football clubs are too important. They are too critical. They are too much a part of our lives, our identity, to allow a random person who might have a questionable background to be the custodian. And we talk about owners, but the good owners always will say that they are the custodians of the club. And indeed, when we had the West Bromwich Albion owner on, that's how he referred to himself, which I think is encouraging, that some people get it. Whereas for other owners, they just see themselves, it's just part of my portfolio of assets. Here's a suggestion: get a slightly different portfolio that doesn't involve something which means so much to your consumers.
Yeah, or doesn't involve Adrian having to learn a third language and take advance from civil servants all over the country in an attempt to find out who the actual owner of a club is. It's and to be fair to Adrian, he does acknowledge that there are decent owners. I think if you're a member of the FA and you're looking for fairness from Adrian's book, you're not going to find it, because he does ask a question all the way through, Kieran, as we talked about, which is becoming increasingly difficult to answer, which is, what is the FA for in the world of modern football?
Yes, it has done some good. We've seen the success of the Lionesses, but remember, this is the same football association which banned women's football for 50 years.
Yeah.
It sort of lives in reflected delight when the England team does well. That's fair enough. But my main concern is that it washed its hands of the professional game when the Premier League was set up in 1992. And again, if I had my way, the Football Association would be the regulator of the professional game. But I don't think it's good enough. I don't think it's smart enough. I don't think it wants the job either. It's which I find very disappointing. And certainly at grassroots level, there are fundamental things which are wrong with tiers 7, 8, 9 and below, which need to be addressed. But there doesn't appear to be the appetite from the Football Association to deal with them, because their focus is on the England team and the glory that brings. And I absolutely get it, trying to bring in new rules that we don't have concrete fences around the perimeter of a football ground because of the dangers. It's not very sexy, but it could help save lives.
And finally, Kieran, I'm not immersed in the culture of Manchester in the same way you are, in the culture of the whole Northwest. Whilst I have misgivings about the people who own Manchester City and Newcastle, as an outsider, I can't help but noticing that part of Manchester that, to me, 25 years ago was in desperate need of reconstruction, has been reconstructed by the owners of Man City, and that the economy and the infrastructure of Manchester has improved vastly because of that. But one question... It's always easy to get distracted when you're interviewing Adrian. But there was one question I did want to put to him, but I'll put to you, which is, when it comes to comparing the Manchester project and the Newcastle project, where are they at the moment? How far into the project were Manchester, were Abu Dhabi by this time, compared to how far in Newcastle are? Because it seems to an outsider that there hasn't been the rapid progress that perhaps people expected to see when it comes to spending both in the city of Newcastle and on the football team of Newcastle.
Yes, I think that is a valid point. Sheikh Mansour has transformed the east part of Manchester. There have been huge positives. They've now got more. There are more jobs. There are more events. There is a greater spend as far as new buildings are concerned. And if you talk to City fans, and if you talk to some United fans, some United fans will be opposed full stop, and I absolutely get that. They will say, doesn't mean that we necessarily approve 100% of the owners of our football. In fact, I think you could look at every single football club and say, well, can I say that every single thing that owner has done, I'm entirely in agreement with? You don't get to be multimillionaires and billionaires by helping little old ladies across the road. So they all tend to have a ruthlessness amongst them. Some now, that doesn't mean that they are bad owners. It means that they are imperfect, as we all are. So there is an issue. Contrasting to Newcastle, I agree with you. I think there was an expectation amongst the Newcastle United fan base that there would be greater investment. Now, certainly the initial acquisition of the club, which at the time, and I said this, Newcastle was a perfect club to buy because they were in such a strong PSR position under Mike Ashley, because he ran it at such a skinflint budget. So that money was spent, and then they sort of went fast, slow, because what Manchester City didn't have to deal with was cost control, financial fair play, PSR, whatever you want to call it, and that allowed Manchester City to spend as much money as they wanted, and if it didn't work, they just go and sign another 20 or 30 million pound player. Newcastle United are in a much more complicated position to that. But I would also point out that if you'd offered Newcastle United fans 5 years ago 2 participations in the Champions League in 3 years and their first trophy for half a century, they wouldn't have snapped your hand off. They'd have snapped you off. They would have absolutely loved it. So that they have made progress. We all want more, and we all want that more now. So why has that not been achieved? For 2 reasons. First of all, because we're living in a cost control environment. And secondly, PIF have a distraction in terms of Saudi Arabia has been awarded the 2034 World Cup. And the Saudi Pro League is now partially owned by the Public Investment Fund. And I think that their priorities have changed to a certain extent from Newcastle United, whereas in Abu Dhabi that's not been the case.
I'm going to set you a challenge, Kieran. I want you to get Snapped You Off into Vis Profanosaurus as your next contribution. We all know you are the second biggest contributor to the Vis Profanosaurus, so I'm sure you can find a reason to get that in there. So Adrian Goldberg's book, Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football, is available now. Don't forget you can join our Price of Football Club, where you'll get access to our fullback catalogue, ad-free listening, bonus episodes, and more. That's access to our fullback catalogue is a new one.
Yes.
I thought we'd made a pact to destroy those as each week went by, just in case. All you have to do is go to priceoffootball.com and click on Join the Club to sign up today. And if you do so, you'll be doing it in time to join our next Zoom Q&A, which is coming up Bonfire Night, I believe.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Which is always fun. Kieran and I had to be persuaded initially to do that, but we both really look forward to doing it, I have to say.
Well, we both thought that nobody was going to bother to... Who wants to be in a Zoom conversation with us two? That's true. Well, it turns out quite a few people.
Yeah, I'm getting more familiar with people's living rooms in Berwick than I am with mine at the moment. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show, email us at questions@priceoffootball.com. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and find us on YouTube. And we will be back on Tuesday with our next Questions Pod. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
The Price of Football. The Price of Football.